Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us this Saturday afternoon. My name's Zaire Costaniano and I run the exhibitions and curatorial department here at Art League, and we're just so thrilled to have you guys here to celebrate Vincent and to listen to this amazing conversation between him and Kathy Vargas. But before I introduce them, I just want to do some housekeeping things. So first off, we want to thank our supporters for this exhibition and this award. The Erdogan Foundation, the Jacques-Louis Vidal Foundation, Joe, Georgina, and Zoe Diaz, and Doctors Anthony and Annette Brissette. So we're just super grateful for all the support and so much gratitude towards them. Also, we have our gala coming up on October 13th, so if you haven't secured your tickets yet, you can find me or Jenny, or all the info is online as well. We will be honoring Vincent as our 2023 Texas Artist of the Year, Cecily Horton as our 2023 Patron of the Year, and Wendy Watches as our 2023 Lifetime Achievement Award. And Wendy's here with us tonight as well. And one of our amazing co-chairs is here as well. So Lisa, thank you so much for helping us put that together. And then, yeah, so thank you so much to the Art League staff as well, because we are a very small team. Most of us are one-person department, so it really takes so much love and time and effort to put everything together. So just want to acknowledge them as well. But not to take too much time, I do want to introduce Vincent Valdez and Kathy Vargas. So Vincent started drawing at the age of 3, and by the age of 10, he had met one of his longtime mentors and friends, Alex Rubio. It's through Alex Rubio that he really realized that he wanted to pursue art as a career, and was also instrumental into introducing him to Kathy Vargas, who's here with us today to talk about just what San Antonio was like at the time and their blossoming mentorship and friendship. Kathy is a renowned international artist herself. She's currently a professor at the Incarnate Word in San Antonio. And she was also the director of the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center between 1985 and 2000. So over the 15 years, when Vincent was first introduced to her, Kathy put him in his first group show at the age of 16, and many years later, at the age of 21, gave him his first solo exhibition, which was sold out, well attended, and that's also where he met Joe Diaz. So Kathy and Vincent are going to talk a little bit about that relationship, and yeah, we're just so thrilled to have you guys. It's such a pleasure. But I'm going to pass this off to you.
Yeah.
Kathy and I are really amazing to have you all here today. You gave up, you sacrificed a Saturday afternoon to be here. This nice air conditioning, please. But it really is an honor not only to be here in the presence of a giant, Kathy Vargas, a tremendously important, powerful, beautiful American artist. It has also been such an amazing compliment to work with curator Zaira and the team here at the Art League. Absolutely a great experience. Like, this is a real team, joint community effort here. And so the fact that we, in our own ways, are supporting this organization, a nonprofit, is a really important thing, especially at a moment like this. Kathy and I are going to just have a conversation together, as we have for probably 3 decades. And we're going to share this mic back and forth. If you're having trouble hearing in the back, just give us a signal and let us know.
So thank you all for coming. Thanks to the space and all the wonderful people who work here for making us feel so welcome. It's been great to be here. And with that, I think we will start. one of the things I've always asked Vincent and never gotten a straight answer to, because he was so young when I met him and at the same time so skilled, is how did you start and what was the moment that you committed? Because for young artists, that's a big deal. The moment when they say, I'm willing to take that leap of faith, to believe in myself as an artist. When I was at the Guadalupe, it was my great pleasure to see young artists who were just forming. And we had so many great helpers on the board, in the community, who helped fund our experiences there and helped fund our presentation of folks like Vincent. And actually, Mimi Swartz is here, and she's hiding, but her parents, especially her dad, were instrumental in helping us fund the efforts of the Guadalupe. And you're right, it's so important for nonprofits to have that support. But back to Vincent, one of the things I always wanted to know was, what was the moment? And we were just talking about that, so show them the draw.
Sure. Because drawing is so natural for me, I assumed that everybody knew how to draw. And I was doing it as a baby, according to my parents. And but I remember going to my grandparents' house, the Valdez's, in the south side of San Antonio. And that really was that experience shaped the course of my entire life, because I would see paintings like this painting from 1939 in this back corner, painted by my great-grandfather, Jose Maria Valdez. I never met him, but I knew him. We had this communication through the paintings that were hanging inside of this little tiny crooked house that still stands today. It was like my first museum experience. And I was so obsessed. I just wanted to understand, what is this? These images painted on canvas. He was a classical painter. Dreamt of being a full-time studio working artist, but never fulfilled that dream. Was a frustrated artist. And so I would sit in this little dark hallway outside of the bathroom, and all my siblings and cousins would be outside running around, and I would sit inside these hallways obsessively trying to copy on my school sheet paper. And I would get so frustrated and angry because I couldn't make it look like he did. So fast forward a few years, I meet artist Alex Rubio, who was 19 years old at that time. Tremendously powerful artist, still living and working today in San Antonio. I meet him at a community mural project in the 5th grade. Alex immediately sees that there's something different that I'm doing versus in relationship to my peers. And so Alex takes me under his wing, right? He's 19 years old, think about this. I'm 9 years old. That's a strange thing, right? But my parents knew, they saw that for the first time in my life that I had a strong connection. I could see myself reflected in somebody else. And my mother and my father allowed me to just kind of go into Alex's world and explore with him. And that's a really rare thing. But to answer your question specifically, I think the absolute moment that it struck me, this is it, like this is going to be the rest of my life, is I walked into Alex's studio at that time at the Visual Arts Annex at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. I think the oldest Chicano Mexican American resource center in the nation. And I walked into Alex's studio, and on this drawing board was this image. This is titled Drive-By. Alex created this piece probably at about 19 or 20 years old. And it's Alex's reflection of how, and memory of how he envisioned the young individuals who did a drive-by shooting in his neighborhood and shot him in the chest at age 17, right, which he survived. And I never forget, being this high and just standing frozen in my tracks before this image, and it was like a ton of bricks had just hit me in the stomach, and I just remember at that moment the feeling, the powerful force created by this image, and I said, this is it. I want to follow in Alex's footsteps. I want to be able to tell stories that connect me to the world and the world to me. How do I do this? I wanted the work to resonate as powerfully as that. And it really in itself became, a life-altering experience for me. It's probably a very premature age.
And I remember meeting you at that time, but I remember that you were so young, and I couldn't believe that someone so young was so good and so determined and so directed, because you knew exactly what you wanted to do. Even when you were 16, you knew where it was you were going. And you knew what your influences were. Hey, they're here. Louise and all of those folks. And we were so excited. Okay, one of the things a curator does, in addition to putting shows together, is to find young artists and to go, wow. The wow experience, as I call it, is one of the best you can have. And Vincent and Alex were both that wow experience, to see their work and to be absolutely floored, even as young as they were. That's how we came about your first show. Because you had gone away. As a matter of fact, we were always friends, pals, because of the music. Because we were always drawn to the same music. We were drawn to the Doors, we were drawn to Simon and Garfunkel. And I don't know where you picked up on, was it from your parents?
Not at all.
Tell me about that.
My parents would have been more like Neil Diamond.
It's not bad.
I think it is important to note that, again, even at 14 years old, 15 years old, then Alex introduces me to Kathy Vargas. Alex is only 22, 23 years old. So Kathy is a mentor to both of us, right? We're both now looking up to somebody like Kathy. And I gotta say, I think one of the most special memories that I have about my lifetime, at age 46, is I look back and I reflect about how rare it was also that these veteran artists like Kathy, they never ever saw me as a kid who was just sort of hanging around. One of the most influential, inspiring, important, and powerful lessons that they taught me was about respect between artists. They always treated me, even at that age, as a colleague. And I'll never forget that. I'm eternally grateful for this. When I met people like Cesar Martinez, Luis Jimenez, who are these other walking giants, living and breathing. These are the few names that I can identify with in the books. And I meet these guys, and they all just sort of formed a circle around me. Never did they sort of shun me out as like, well, yeah, kid, one day, but you got a lot to learn. I was like a sponge, and I would just absorb this information as much as I could. And it was really, I think for a young artist, especially nowadays, that sort of rite of passage doesn't really exist in the same way that it once did in what I consider to be the old world, which really wasn't that long ago. I'd say nowadays the art schools have become that rite of passage, right? But I feel so fortunate to have that experience of just being, it was my first education in many ways. And so as I got to know Kathy, we began talking about music, and I was obsessed with Jim Morrison and the Doors. It was something so anti-everything that was on the radio or on the record player in my house. And it had this sort of moody, broody darkness that I kind of identified with. And so Kathy and I began talking about music and her experience as an interest in rock and roll photography at the heyday of American rock and roll, right? The late 60s, early 70s. And so she begins to share artists with me like Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, right? So you see this vintage poster of a Bob Dylan concert that Zyra and I put in here for Kathy, in honor of Kathy. And so I think that, beyond the conversation of painting and drawing and art history, Kathy and I would go record shopping together every Friday. And it was payday. And it was the greatest thing because I would walk through the record stores and the CD shops with Kathy. And I remember, like, at age 16, I could pick anything I wanted, and she would deduct it from my pay, right? Because I would be there as an assistant to Alex, helping out throughout the Guadalupe in his classes, and we would just talk about music. And to this day, music is something that is such a powerful and important component within my studio practice. It's evident in the work, and I think a lot of that. The reason is from my memories and my experience of those days with Kathy.
And what Vincent doesn't know is that he got a few freebies too. I don't know from Alex. But the point is, we both saw a depth in him that was not common among young artists. Because a lot of, and you're right, academia has a lot to do with it. I teach now. So a lot of young artists don't have that sense of history and cultural history. And I don't just mean Latino cultural history, I mean musical cultural history, literary cultural history, theatrical cultural history. They don't know about hair or rent or any number of what I think of as deeper research into the arts. They want to know what's hot right now. And I think in Vincent, both Alex and I saw someone who's going to dig deep. And so we wanted to keep feeding him. And some of that was music, and some of that was books, and some of that was visual. And I think for all of us, this becomes an investment. And I think you're absolutely right about how artists learn to be artists now. Because most young artists that I'm teaching are basically saying, well, I'll go through the academy and I'll get my degree or my degrees and I'll be done. And I think artists who came from the streets, so to speak, because I did too, my first art experiences were not in the universities. I think those of us who came from that direction understood that there was a lot more to know and a lot more to look at than simply the art history class we were taking. And while we loved the art history classes and we grew from them, it was also about every culture and everything in culture. And, well, we should talk about the contemporary art world and how that maybe differs from the worlds we came from.
Those days of digging through the archives of places like the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, I would listen to these conversations that were being had within the artists in the studios at that complex, between artists like Kathy and collector Joe Diaz, whose collection you see in here. And I would go back home, I was still in middle school, high school, and I remember feeling so fired up, and I began talking to my parents for the first time and saying things like, I'm Chicano. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in the south side of San Antonio, all Mexican American. And what an experience, what a memory of this sort of moment of this self-awareness. Who am I, and where do I fit in? And then my mother responding, don't ever say that. Don't say that word, that's a bad word. Well, what do you mean it's a bad word? Kathy says it, Alex says it, Cesar says it, Joe says it. I'm proud to call myself a Chicano. Why is that a bad word? And then I began to realize, wow, it's much more complicated than I think or than most of us are aware of. So then I go on to the Rhode Island School of Design. And at that moment in time, I think that the entire world is like Texas because Texas is its own world in many ways, or so it thinks. And I thought that everybody ate breakfast tacos and knew who Flaco Jimenez was. And then I get there and holy crap, Providence, Rhode Island. What am I doing here? Why am I here? And for the first time, I can see, I go from one environment plucked out and thrown into this new environment where I can identify with nothing or no one. I would remember going into the RISD library because they're notorious, they're famous for, it's one of the oldest art schools in America, and this amazing library's resource. And I would spend every single day in this library, tens of thousands, if not millions of books, and I would play this game with myself. I was determined, I'm gonna find one damn book in this library that has a last name that's similar to mine, or that is work that's reflective of mine. And after 3 years, I found 0. In the final semester of my schooling at RISD, I run into one book by Luis Jimenez, and I was so excited. I hit the jackpot. But it was placed in the Latin American category, which is the tiniest category throughout the library. I thought, wow, this is really a problem. But I felt so so determined and ambitious to bring these stories and these tales from Texas with me. Because I would sit in art history class, and the entire American Southwest is just entirely wiped out, erased from the canon of American art history. And I would think about my memories of Kathy and Alex and this world that I sort of embodied with me and think and question, but why aren't these names as important as a Georgia O'Keeffe or as a Mark Rothko? Because goddamn, their paintings and their images are just as powerful, and they speak just as there's an amount of conviction that is as determined and as powerful about the American experience. It was an injustice. And I think that thus is the tale of the Mexican American in this country. Sort of caught in a purgatory-like state when it comes to a national sense of identity. You're neither white nor black. You're neither American nor Mexican. You're sort of hovering somewhere in a limbo's kind of state of being, but this becomes yet another fascinating facade of the American story. I am convinced. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but...
Well, I think we can take that in a different direction too, because when we look at Chicano art, which has expanded to Latinx art, the new category, we look at, in a lot of this work, yours and Luis's, we look at a place between reality and mythology. And at that point in time, from the 70s forward, the art world didn't want to look at reality. They were busy with conceptual and postmodern. And they didn't understand our mythology. And so it becomes a matter of how do we tell the art world that we exist and that our existence is important, and how do we interpret reality and mythology to people who don't get it and don't care to get it. And that has become an issue that is still with us a lot, even into the present. It's getting better, but trying to understand or make someone from the outside understand, trying to understand how someone who isn't us thinks, and trying to understand how we can interpret ourselves to them. You do it very well, so I'm going to give the microphone back to you in a moment. But I think this becomes a vital equation to not only make them care, but to make them understand, and to then not have there be a them. but to have all of us together involved in this understanding.
I'm going to ask you first, though, what are some of the ways throughout your life and career, but especially in the work, the concepts behind the work, what are the ways that you pierce those skins that help to transcend that work beyond a regionalism, a context of just being labeled as a Chicano artist? How, in your own sort of framework, do you interpret that you are, as an artist, that the work is symbolic and it's representative of this much larger identity and experience?
Well, I think it's not just me. Wendy Watrous is here. She's back there. I think PhotoFest has done so much for photographers to make them connect on an international level, so that it's not just how America sees, because when we talk about the art world, we're mostly talking about America and Europe. It's expanding now. It's going into Turkey, it's going into the Arab Emirates, it's going into South America, and finally the art world, in a sense, is catching up with the photo world. Because the photo world, see, I'm lucky, I'm a photographer. The photo world was always globally connected, and the photo world was always willing to deal with reality. When I was at the Guadalupe, I felt that a part of my job, was to make people understand. And I think the best artists we presented were those who were helping us, who are not closing themselves off, not turning themselves back on what we consider the mainstream, but to say to the mainstream, we are here, we matter, our perspective matters. And I think maybe that's why I said, wow, when somebody who is so young got that. Because you got that, Luis got that, Cesar understood that, Mel Casas understood that. And so when I look at the California artists, always understood that. When you look at people like Blanc or Amalia Mesa Baines, you see people who understood that they had to pierce that skin. And when you talk about the Royal Chicano Air Force, they were in the museum literally tearing walls down, tearing doors down. And I think that first generation did that, but it's been up to subsequent generations to say we are relevant and we are part of the picture, and whether don't put us in the margins again, because we have important voices to contribute to the mainstream. We are the mainstream. The mainstream right now is mixed. The mainstream right now is culturally everywhere. And a lot of your work represents, I always remember your piece, Blaxican, about your brother, which is about cultural mixing. And that's who we are now. And it's time that we all understood that.
I mean, I think that for me, it was, I would set up these challenges for myself back in the day, in the early years right after I got out of school. I came back to San Antonio, got a studio inside the Visual Arts Annex. At that time, it's Guadalupe. Met Lucy Lepard. For me, it was, I remember sitting down in the studio, and I never felt that leisure of just staring at a blank canvas and just trying to paint for the sake of painting, right? There was 100 other sort of topics racing through my mind. Okay, how am I going to create a painting? How am I going to make it good? How is it going to cover, how is it going to go beyond an audience other than my own community? How is it going to speak to a much broader viewer while covering grounds between past and present, myth and reality? I mean, I was trying to do these entire checklists of as means of pushing myself as a young artist, and but I remember in those very formative early years, like I'd say the first 2 to 3 years in the art world, the frustration, because I immediately saw what I was up against. You know, the phone would ring, obviously, every month during Hispanic Heritage Month. Hey, we need your work, you know. Every other month, that phone was not ringing. We have the Day of the Dead show coming up, and the frustration I would feel about trying to prove that this work was worthy, that the images that I was creating and the stories that I was telling were far beyond, yes, they were relevant to my community, but I was trying to examine America as a community, right? Whether it was my own generation or past generations, I felt like I was walking on the shoulders of artists who had come before me and were maybe able to open with their big toe, you know, squeak open a door, and my intention was to get my entire foot in, knowing that one day, as I got older, that I would open that door for the next generation to walk through without having to force their way through. And so photographers like Kathy or like Larry Burroughs, who I looked at a whole lot of amazing war correspondent, especially during the Vietnam War, and I was gaining so much visual information as influence and inspiration, because I saw in images, the powerful impacting images from people like Larry Burroughs and Larry Clark. A lot of photographers and filmmakers I was looking at more than I was painters. It really is the way that I learned how to frame and how to tell a story, how to sequence an image and a narrative that unfolds before your eyes, so that the act of storytelling, I think for me and for many in the brown community, I think it's so embedded in our DNA, right, to tell stories.
And I think that was one of the things I saw. I could understand your stories. I could look at your work, and I knew exactly who you were talking about, what you were talking about. And a lot of other people did too. Your first show sold out, and not all of the people who bought your work were Latino. You know, and that, I think, for me, was a huge success for you, because it meant we can get the message out to people who weren't looking for a message. And you always had a message. It was always, I could always tell that you were trying to tell me something, that you were trying to tell the viewer something. And that mattered tremendously. And you're still doing that. So I want to know what you're working on these days.
Too many things, you know. It's like my biggest challenge now isn't the ideas or the ambition, it's trying to finish something in the studio. Let's see if I had to select one. I just completed, after the past 6 months, I think the ultimate goal as an artist for me, whether it was then or now, has always been to find ways to reinvent myself, to challenge myself to do something fresh, to say it in a new way. Never did I want to be predictable as an artist, as a painter. I feared viewers walking in and walking past the piece because they said immediately, oh, well, you know, that's Vincent's work and we've seen 6 others that, you know, are similar. I always wanted to keep people on their toes and to throw curveballs. And so one of the ways that I'm able to do this is, I spent the last 6 months working on a project that's entirely different from me. I joined forces with an amazing press called Arion Press in San Francisco. They are the last remaining press on this side of the planet that publishes books in the old school, old world fashion, which is all by letterpress. Every single letter, every font known to man exists on these shelves. It was just amazing. It's like walking back into the 17th century. And we partnered with the Kurt Vonnegut estate, and I created a series of 23 drawings for Kurt Vonnegut's amazing, important American novel, Slaughterhouse-Five. My goal, because it would have been too easy for me to simply just make 20 drawings, hand them over as illustrations, job done. No, I had to sit there in the studio and say, how could I challenge myself to do something that hasn't been done before? Not only in terms of the way that a book like Slaughterhouse 5 has been refashioned, repackaged, but as an artist, how can I do something that is very different for me and that in many ways is a challenge? And so I chose to create drawings that were skewed from a different perspective. I used my great uncle Ernest Valdez, who served in the European theater in World War II, and coincidentally, just like the main character in Kurt Vonnegut's novel, Billy Pilgrim, just like Kurt Vonnegut himself, they both fought in the Ardennes Forest in 1945, December, during the Battle of the Bulge. My great uncle Ernest was also in that very same battle. Like Kurt Vonnegut and Billy Pilgrim, who were captured by the Germans after they were overrun and taken as POWs for a year, my great uncle Ernest was captured by the Germans and held as POW before he was liberated. And finally, like Pilgrim and Vonnegut, Ernest Valdez lived the rest of his life, returned to San Antonio, but suffered from extreme PTSD. And so I had this original small letter from the War Department that was sent home from the Ardennes Forest by Uncle Ernest to his younger brother, my grandfather, who was on a ship on his way to Europe. And he was telling his younger brother how to survive and return home to mom and dad. We took that envelope and I came to the press and said, I want to use this as the source of inspiration. I want to challenge you as the press to use this artifact as an inspiration for the design and packaging. I want the viewer, when they receive this book, it's like you are receiving this much dreaded letter from the War Department. You know, the kind that you open up and says, we regret to inform you that your son is killed in action or missing. I wanted to transport you there as a time traveler, as an experiential situation, and they were crazy enough to do it. And so we just had the launch event last week, and it's amazing. I mean, it's a powerful thing for me to walk in and see this book now with the drawings inside, but that same letter is now the box that serves as a slipcase for the book. And to know now that, like, in my own tiny way, I've entirely reshaped that work of art by Vonnegut as seen through a different perspective, right? A new lens again, and through the eyes of a Mexican-American experience. This is my tiny contribution in the world of trying to push back, to counter, you know, whether it's social amnesia, to counter mainstream topics, or just the efforts of trying to do as an American artist what the United States of America claims to be, right? An experience, a unified experience for all. And I think that for me, the telling of these stories and these histories really about all of us as a collective society is what's more important now than it ever has been before in many ways. And I really mean that. I think that the struggle and the conflict that we find ourselves in today as a collective society differs in many ways from previous centuries or generations in a way that we're not really quite prepared to not only tackle but to understand and comprehend, because the war on history leads to a war on critical thought, leads to a war on creativity and creative thinking. And they all line up hand in hand. And I think that it's important, you know, to not fool ourselves that in a city like Houston, which is a city that I call home and that I love tremendously as a community, as progressive and forward-thinking as it is, we cannot forget the region that we're in, not only in this state, but in this country. The history that lingers and hovers around us in subtle and visible ways, right? You can go 2 miles straight down the street and see a giant statue of Sammy Houston. For me, that's extremely problematic. And it's not included in the conversations, the current conversations, right? I think Texas is different in that way, much more so than a state like California, because we don't have the powerhouse academic institutions like the UCLAs and the USCs that are writing, that are implementing their own input into national publications, right? There's a reason that most of this nation doesn't really realize that the state of Texas, as flawed and problematic as it is politically, is still writing and determining the public education books for this entire nation. There's a reason this isn't being spoken about as often or as loudly as it should, but this is the struggle today, and I think as an artist, this will be my life's effort, whether I want it to be or not. I mean, it's sort of like my conscience won't allow me. It's like Howard Zinn once said, you cannot stand neutral on a moving train.
And that goes back to the whole Jim Morrison reality, because every generation goes through it. In the 60s, it was the rock and rollers, people like Jefferson Airplane, who were saying, up against the wall. And in my art era, I remember the AIDS generation and the 80s, and how much art censorship there was then, and how Mapplethorpe was forbidden, and Serrano was forbidden. And we lost National Endowment for the Arts grants because we didn't, or the country, the government didn't want them going to people like Mapplethorpe and Serrano. And so we'd rather not give any of you money because we don't want to take the chance that they'll fall into problematic hands. And now your generation is having a different age of censorship. It's educational censorship. And we keep coming up against these giant bumps in the road that can upset the entire apple cart or the entire car or the entire whatever. And it's, Mimi, I'm going to call it, but you wrote an article about, that I read in the New York Times, about Texas and about how we're not all like this. Yeah.
Constantly apologizing.
Apologizing for Texas, which needed to be done at that time because we've got people at the border who are desperate. How do we help them instead of killing them? Instead of pushing moms who are giving birth back into the water, having them miscarry, instead of having babies die in that water because their parents let go of them with cancer. And how do we find a place, not only in the United States, but there are people from Africa, quote unquote, invading Europe. And Europe can't figure out what to do with it. Great Britain can't figure out what to do with it. They're trying to push away their people. They're African refugees. They're refugees from the Middle East. And here we've got earthquake after earthquake, thanks to our cars, our global warming, and refugees that have been created now in Morocco and Turkey, all over the planet. And what do we do with these refugees? What do we do with these people who need help? And how do we include them? How do we expand? And I love it that artists like Vincent are making us look at this, making us look at the political realities that exist in other countries that make people feel that they are required to flee. And how on earth do we fix everything? How on earth do we accept? This is not, the thing is, in a sense, people of color were always pushed to the margins. And then the AIDS epidemic happened. And all of a sudden, gay people found themselves pushed to the margin. Even if they've been living quietly in the world and not that out, all of a sudden, oh, you could have AIDS. You could be a source of death. Well, people of color have always been seen as sources of death. At bottom line, we're the ones who usually get killed. And now we have a whole other generation that is looking at things like Black Lives Matter, what we expect from our police. Do we expect protection, or are we afraid when we get stopped by a police car? what happens now. And I think you're addressing that globally, not just for Chicanos anymore, but globally. What was once a Chicano reality is now a global reality. And how do we integrate? And by the way, how do we integrate into the art world? Talk about your experiences in the art world, because the art world is a very different place from the real world.
You know, it truly is, and it becomes like the Twilight Zone when I think about it. I mean, again, it really, 20 years ago is not that long ago. And I remember 20 years ago just starting out in the art world, and it's like night and day today. And 20 years ago, the art world could care less about, I always felt like I had 3 strikes against me as a painter. I painted with actual skills. And back 20 years ago, that was a no-no. I painted the figure, oh my God, like nobody cared about the figure. And I cared about depicting personal stories, and I struck 3, you were out, buddy. But I stuck with it. It was the thing that I felt most passionate about and excited and in love with. I was dedicated to the legacy of the human figure in drawing and painting. And I think that, like I mentioned a little earlier, in the art world, one of the first obstacles that I saw was, as a young Mexican-American painter, the historians and the curators and the writers just didn't know what to do with me. They just didn't know. They liked the work because they expressed it and, oh, you're so talented and the ideas and you're so young, but yeah, we can't touch this because your subjects are just a little bit too harsh for people right now. 20 years later, we can't get enough of the human figure in painting and drawing, social-political themes and topics. But today, at this stage in my career, what I find is that many curators, dealers out there, they still don't quite know what to do with me. But there's a part of me, a stubborn part of me, that's always taking great pride in just going my own direction. When I see everybody going left, I'll go right. And this is what makes me appreciate artists like Peter Saul in his late 80s, early 90s, still painting today. But you're talking about an American painter, a genius, a master, that for the majority of his career, like other artists before him, Philip Guston, who had their own vision, stuck with it, and paid the price, were largely ignored by the American art establishment. But their ultimate sort of middle finger was, I did it anyway. And as much as I wanted to, especially when I was younger, just aspire to have the work on these certain platforms and level of the art world, I mean, I will say there still is that part of me that's just like, that realizes and recognizes you're probably going to end up following in that same sort of tradition and footstep as artists like Guston and Saul and George Bellows. But maybe that's the burning desire in the end, is just knowing that I never really felt it fit in, and maybe I was doomed with the middle child syndrome. It's just never feeling quite like you know how you fit into the world. But that's the search, right? That's the constant, endless search in the work of trying to find ways to connect and make sense of it all. And so one of the things, when I was presented with the opportunity by part of this award is that you, as the artist, showcase your exhibition, and I said to both Jenny and Zaira, well, we can showcase my work in the one gallery, but I really wanted to use this space as an opportunity to pay honor and respect to those artists who really pushed me and motivated me in cerebral ways as a youngster. I wanted to present you, the viewer, with a kind of an insight into the images that have kept me going all of these years, these are the people that I've carried with me the closest, most of which are not in the history books, but they exist in here and in here. And for me, that was everything. That was enough to get me through those moments in the studio where you feel, the moments of self-doubt and uncertainty. I always just go back to the handful of individuals, and I remember that feeling in the burning pit of my stomach as a kid standing before that Rubio drawing, seeing Kathy's portraits of her mother on the porch. That's the feeling that I never want to let go of. Right? As long as that flame is burning, I know it's going to be okay. It's enough to just keep me fighting. How are we on time, Sarah?
You're good.
Yeah.
If you want to keep, we can open it up to questions.
Sure.
I was going to
Okay.
say, maybe one more footnote, that should teach us something about the art world. That it's not about what's hip right now. It's about what's going to last for the ages. As a photographer, I think of people like Robert Frank. When the Americans came out, the critics panned it like you wouldn't believe. If he'd listened, he would have stopped what he was doing. 10 years later, everybody was imitating Robert Frank. Diane Arbus wanted to be Robert Frank. Everybody who came after him wanted to be Robert Frank. And he moved on. He was making videos, he was doing something else, he was working with the Rolling Stones. He was saying, okay, you do what you want, art world. I'm gonna go be Robert Frank now. And maybe that's the lesson for artists, is maybe what you're doing to explore yourself matters much more than whether or not the art world comes and pats you on the back about it.
Awesome. Can we get a quick round of applause for the Okay, I think we have time for around 5 questions, so if anyone wants to... Oh, we'll go...
The special edition of Slaughterhouse 5 sounds fascinating to me. What was the name of the press? How could one see it on camera?
Arion.
Dance back and forth.
Arion Press, which is A-R-I-O-N.
Thank you for a very moving and very intelligent discussion. I have a question that's really for both of you, but in a way particularly for Kathy. It was 1993-94 when I, with you and 3 other Latino curators, put together the American Voices show. And we had very, very similar discussions that far back. How much of a point of the often abused word inflection, point of inflection, do you think we are now? Do you think that a process of change has started, of realization of the multifaceted nature of culture? Or do you think we will slip back again?
I'm terrified that we will flip back again because of our attitude toward immigrants. I remember when Donald Trump was first elected, I was at a Target. I was just standing in line to pay for my stuff. And a very large, very pale man literally shoved his way in front of me in line. And I think it was because he felt he had a right to be there before me. And I think at that point in time, America and Texas were changing. The power structure was changing, and people were thinking, I don't have to be politically correct anymore. I can tell you exactly what I think of you, Mexican. And they didn't know how long my family had been here. When I see textbooks changing, when I see the rewriting of history, it scares the bejesus out of me. And at the same time, the world is changing. There are immigrants everywhere. Every culture is changing. The US culture is changing. The culture of Great Britain is changing. Everywhere it's changing, and I think there's going to be pushback. I think what's going to happen with Latinos is that we, who have maybe been here for generations, may be seen as newcomers. And what's that going to do to everything we've earned? Plus, we're trying to get rid of political correctness. We're trying to get rid of, in a sense of being respectful. We're trying to get rid of the gains we've made in education. My students are going to have a very hard time.
I try to remind others through this quote as often as I can. We are the United States of amnesia. We learn nothing because we remember nothing. In the haunting wise words of American writer and critic Gore Vidal, historically speaking, we know how this tale ends. Thus, there's a reason that we see such a pushback and an erasure of history today at a more rapid and alarming pace than ever. I think what I fear most is people that do not understand or know their history can very easily be manipulated. And so I think that the 21st century America differs itself in a historic, it's an unprecedented, unmatched moment in history in the way that the marriage, the union of the police state and the corporations, not only in this country but globally now. This is a global effort. These are the Goliaths of our time that we're facing. And when these things go hand in hand, again, the tale of history has never ended well. We know how this ends. But again, how can we expect a society to see their own fate looming on the horizon like a mirage if you don't know these tales? So many distractions in the world, but especially in modern America, where we are more in tune with the Beyonce show tonight and concerned about the entertainment and the spectacle than we are with our own destinies. The future of young people in this country and beyond, all sort of nicely, thickly padded and layered with a patina of environmental disaster that is quickly coming our way. There's so much work to be done, but I feel at the same time, Wendy, to maybe more specifically answer your question, I do think that the world there are pockets of light and change and hope that glimmer off in the horizon. I think that along with this comes a pushback from the old ways and the old traditions and the old methods that are oppressive. And so I imagine this moment, if I had to construct a visual image of it, it's a dying dog that knows it's dying, but like a dying dog, it's not going to go belly up. It's going to fight until its last. Yeah, it's going to fight and fight until its very last dying breath. This is the moment that we're in.
We only had time for 2 questions. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much again. A round of applause. And the catalog for this exhibition and Vincent Award Undercurrents will be released October 13th. We'll be having a book talk on that sometime in early November, and we'll let y'all know once we iron out all the details, but we hope you join us for that. But thank you so much again, and hope y'all have a great rest of your Saturday.